At 7,200 meters, just below the summit of India's second highest peak, 22-year-old Nanda and her team are trapped. They've been crammed inside a tent barely bigger than a coffin for over 80 hours, waiting out a storm that refuses to let up. Outside, the wind is ruthless, tearing at the fabric like a wild animal trying to rip it apart. The walls snap and buckle with each violent gust, groaning under the pressure. Every few minutes, another blast slams into them, like a sledgehammer, making the whole structure shudder. Snow piles up fast, pressing in from all sides, trying to bury them alive. Inside, the three climbers huddle together, wrapped in layers that stopped keeping them warm a long time ago. Their bodies are stiff. Their breath hangs in the freezing air for a second before disappearing. Sleep is out of the question. Hunger doesn't even matter anymore. All that's left is the cold and the exhaustion. But for Nanda, it's worse. So much worse. She curls into herself, shaking like a leaf, her skin pale, her lips a deep, unnatural blue. For days, she's been throwing up non-stop, her stomach cramping like it's being twisted from the inside. But worst of all, the blood. It's pooling into every bit of waste her body forces out, draining what little strength she has left. And still, through it all, she hears them. The voices of everyone who told her not to do this, who said it was too much, too dangerous, that she was pushing too far. They told her to turn back, that she wasn't strong enough, that she didn't belong here. But she never listened. She couldn't listen. She had something to prove, that she wasn't weaker, that she could just climb as high, push just as hard, endure just as much as any man who had ever set foot on this mountain, her mountain. But now, sitting in that tent, trapped in a body that was failing her, she couldn't help but wonder, had she really won that fight? This is her story. In the far northeast of India, deep in the Garhwal Himalayas of Uttarakhand, the Rishi Ganga River carves its way through towering cliffs and thick forests, cutting a deep, rugged gorge known as the Rishi Ganga Gorge. Along its side, a narrow trail snakes through the wilderness, rough and uneven, leading to a small village called Lata, sitting at about 2,300 meters in altitude. This is where the last human settlement of the region ends. Beyond this point, there are no roads, no settlements, just days of trekking on foot through steep, unforgiving paths. The trail climbs higher and higher, twisting through dense forests, crossing icy mountain streams, and skirting the edges of sheer cliffs that drop straight into the gorge below. With each passing day, the air gets thinner. The trees fade and the landscape shifts to nothing but rock and ice. Then suddenly, the world opens up. The sky feels endless and the silence is almost deafening. And right there ahead of you, towering peaks rise, one after another, like guards standing watch over Forbidden Kingdom. These are among the tallest peaks in India, but beyond them, at the very heart of the mountain stronghold, stands the massive, untouchable, 7,817 meter tall goddess, Nanda Devi. It was here in 1949, surrounded by the breathtaking, almost surreal vastness of the Himalayas, where a young American mountaineer, William Francis Unsweld, first fell in love with the fearsome beauty of Nanda Devi. Years later, he would recall that moment, saying, "I was so struck by its beauty that I realized I needed to get married to have a daughter that I hoped would be beautiful enough to be named after Nanda Devi." And sure enough, just 2 years later, he did. Out of his 4 children, his second oldest daughter was given the name that had stayed with him ever since that first encounter, Nanda Devi Unsweld. Born in 1954, Nanda Devi, or just Devi as her family liked to call her, was everything her father could have asked for in a daughter. She was full of life, fearless, always up for an adventure, and most of all loved being outdoors. That wasn't just something she picked up on her own. It was just as much as a result of her father's influence as it was her own passion. Being a mountaineer, William made sure his kids grew up with the same love for adventure and risk-taking that shaped his life. In fact, he and his wife Jolene even went so far as to plan their children's births so they'd all be born in May. That way, as they got older, their birthdays would always line up with the start of the summer break, so the whole family could pack up and head straight to the Teton mountain range in southwestern Wyoming, where they made sure the kids got the full outdoor experience in fresh air and open skies year after year. Now, not all of the kids were totally on board with this lifestyle. Some of them never really caught the adventure bug, but Devi lived for it. And so did her brother Crag. The two of them couldn't get enough of the outdoors. Their older brother, Reagan, would often bring up this one memory from when he was 6 and Devi was 4. It was the first time their dad was teaching them how to rappel. Reagan, terrified of heights, was ready to back out until Devi stepped in. She was younger, smaller, and had every reason to hesitate, but she didn't. Before Reagan could talk himself out of it, Devi was already gearing up to go first. Fearless as ever, even at 4 years old. She had that fire in her, the kind of mindset that didn't just embrace a challenge, but ran straight toward it. By the time she hit high school, the same mindset was in full swing. One day, she and her brother Crag decided they were done taking the bus. Instead, they biked to and from school, 17 kilometers each way. Everyone figured they'd give up after a week or so. No way, 2 kids could keep up with 34 kilometers of biking every day. But not only did they stick with it, they ended up forming a whole bike gang out of their friends, riding to school together like it was nothing. For Devi, however, it wasn't just about pushing limits. She had bigger reasons. She wanted to do her part in cutting down pollution, and this was one way she could. She also spent much of her time involved in social causes, like protesting the Vietnam War, joining movements to fight world hunger, and things like that. It wasn't just how she was raised. William didn't just teach his kids to be tough. He made sure they had principles and that they stood for something bigger than themselves. This thoughtful but bold and outgoing personality also left a mark on her schoolmates. They couldn't help but be in awe of her confidence, the way she carried herself, and the natural leadership she had without even trying. She stood out, not just because she was different, but because she owned it. But as they say, the bolder the heart, the harder it is to bend. Somewhere along the way, that fearless, headstrong attitude came with a fair dose of stubbornness too. Not that she noticed, of course. One of her friends once told a story from 1974, when Devi and Crag were out trekking. At some point, Devi started struggling. When Crag asked what was wrong, she just shrugged it off. But when he pressed her, she finally admitted she had blisters. Crag told her to take her boots off, but she flat out refused. Again and again, she insisted she was fine. Only after a whole lot of pushing did she finally give in. And when the boots came off, her feet were soaked in blood. Crag was furious. He reminded her of something their dad had always drilled into them. Being fearless was one thing, but when you're in trouble, you speak up. You trust your team to have your back. That's what survival was about. But of course, Devi being Devi, the whole lecture didn't make much difference. And that, as it turned out, was something that would cost her and her family big time. That same year in 1974, Devi and her brother Crag visited an old family friend, Ad Carter. Carter was part of the British-American expedition that first reached the summit of Nanda Devi in 1936. These days, though, he had settled into a quieter life, teaching foreign languages at a school. Devi and Crag came to him with an idea. They wanted to assemble a family expedition to Nanda Devi's unclimbed north side, which they called a pilgrimage to a sacred place. Since the mountain had first been summited in 1936, they figured making the climb in 1976 would be the perfect way to mark its 40th anniversary, and they wanted Carter to co-lead the expedition alongside their father. For Devi, this mountain had been on her list for as long as she could remember, and for good reason. She had literally been named after it. Her whole childhood had been wrapped up in stories of her namesake peak, and she had been dreaming of standing on it for years. Carter was intrigued. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and he was all on board for the adventure. However, he didn't fully buy into the whole family pilgrimage approach. He knew expeditions like this needed careful planning, so he wanted professionals on the team, climbers with experience handling serious high-altitude expeditions. So over the next 2 years, he reached out to American mountaineers who had tackled similar or even tougher climbs. The first to join was a 26-year-old alpinist named John Roskelly. Roskelly had already summited the 8,167-meter Dhaulagiri in Nepal back in 1973, and was part of the first All-American team to take on the north side of the 3,967-meter Eiger in Switzerland the following year. Like Devi's family, Roskelly was known for his fearless approach to climbing, but that's about where their similarities ended. For starters, Roskelly wasn't exactly thrilled about women being part of climbing expeditions. It wasn't personal, at least not in any way that he'd admit. But he believed mountaineering was a man's game. While plenty of women were getting into it by the mid-70s, it was still a male-dominated field, and in his eyes, high-stakes, high-altitude climbing wasn't the place for distractions that could come up with mixed-gender teams, where emotions could develop and potentially slow things down. He even tried to convince William not to invite a female climber named Marty Hoey, because she was dating another team member, Peter Lev. But that wasn't the only thing that clashed with the Unsuelds. His whole philosophy on climbing was different. To him, mountaineering was more about the milestones, reaching the top, planting the flag, claiming the achievement, being practical. The Unsuelds, on the other hand, saw it as something deeper. They were against the big commercial gear-heavy expeditions that needed massive funding just to get a handful of climbers up a mountain. To them, it felt wrong, especially in a world where people were struggling just to afford a meal. Their trip wasn't about proving anything. It was about the experience and the meaning behind it. Russ Kelly, of course, stood for pretty much everything that went against their beliefs. So the moment he joined, the whole dynamic of the expedition shifted. Cragg wanted nothing to do with it. He pulled out, saying he'd rather put his energy into something meaningful than be part of what now felt like a selfish mission. Devi saw his point, and in a way, she agreed. But the mountain, the one she had been named after, still called to her. She couldn't walk away. Not yet. She did, however, make one thing clear. This would be the last time she took part in something like this. Hauntingly enough, she was right, but not in the way anyone would have ever wanted. After a lengthy process of organizing supplies and ensuring everything was in order, the expedition arrived in New Delhi in early July 1976. When the Indian media caught wind of an expedition to Nanda Devi that included a young woman named after the mountain itself, Devi quickly became a sought-after interview subject. The quiet influence she had on her close friends and fellow climbers now extended to a much larger audience. Drawn to her warm, thoughtful, and fearless approach, the fact that women were rarely part of major mountaineering expeditions also added to the intrigue, making her an even more compelling figure in the public eye. As the team prepared for the journey ahead, they hired a number of local porters to assist with the trek. During their first week en route to the Nanda Devi base camp, the porters took to calling her Didi, meaning sister in their local language. Apart from the natural camaraderie she shared with them, there was another reason for this connection. The villages these porters came from regarded Nanda Devi as a sacred peak, a manifestation of the goddess of bliss. And with Devi bearing the mountain's very name, many of them began to believe that she was in some way the goddess herself, returning in human form to meet her own reflection. In the first 2 weeks of the expedition, the progress was particularly slow. The team was waiting for a crucial member to join them on the trail or at base camp, who had yet to arrive from the US. This delay set the tone for their problems that would plague the expedition moving forward. To begin with, on one of their first nights on the trail, several team members came down with severe food poisoning. While most of them eventually recovered, Marty Hoey, the very climber Ross Skelly had opposed earlier, fell dangerously ill. As the team pushed up to 4,200 meters, she could barely walk, drink, or even speak properly. A few days later, she seemed like she was slipping into a coma. While Roskelly's concerns about her being a distraction due to her relationship with Peter Lev weren't entirely right, they weren't entirely wrong either. As her condition worsened, both Roskelly and the expedition's doctor insisted she descend to a lower altitude. A team mobilized to carry her at least 600 meters down, where she was given supplemental oxygen and began to recover. However, Roskelly and the doctor were still concerned that if she continued the expedition, her condition might worsen again. They argued that she may have suffered from cerebral edema, and that the safest option was to evacuate her. By this point, Roskelly wasn't entirely against her presence on the expedition. Over the past few weeks, he had seen Devi's dedication to climbing, and had grown to respect the presence of female climbers. But despite his shift in attitude, his past comments still loomed over the situation. A divide formed within the team, and many sided with Hoey, believing it would be unfair to force her to abandon the climb. William ultimately left the decision to Hoey herself, and she wasn't willing to back down. But seeing how her condition had split the team in two, she made the difficult choice to withdraw. Even then, several men volunteered to escort her, and some went so far as to leave the expedition entirely in protest against Roskelly. In his eyes, though, this only proved his point. Hoey was an attractive climber, and to him, the men around her were simply acting out of personal interest, making her a distraction after all. Before the heat of this argument could settle, another issue arose, one just as concerning. This time, Devi developed what appeared to be a protruding hernia on her groin. The doctor warned her that going to a higher altitude with her condition was a serious risk. But this was Devi. Not only did she have significant influence over the expedition, but she was also the daughter of the expedition leader, and the one who practically set everything in motion. Beyond all that, with everyone already exhausted from dealing with Hoey's condition, no one really pressed the issue at first. Devi kept herself busy around the campsite. She would move through the night, helping the porters set up tents, using the Hindu and Nepali she had learned in childhood to communicate with them. Before heading to bed, she would join her father in singing camp songs over the flute and harmonica. Basically, she never let anyone see that she was struggling, at least not in the beginning. Meanwhile, Roskelly continued to push back against the Unsoeld's original decision to climb alpine style. For those who don't know, alpine style climbing means tackling the mountain in a single push without relying on fixed ropes, pre-established camps, set paths, or high-altitude porters. It's basically a help-yourself strategy, avoiding the heavy, time-consuming installations that come with traditional expeditions. It's also the least environmentally destructive way to climb, leaving behind minimal waste, something the Unsoelds deeply believed in. In fact, they were so committed to this philosophy that the expedition left most of their ropes and heavy climbing equipment behind, convinced they wouldn't need them. Roskelly, on the other hand, was once again more practical. With porters already on board and the expedition large enough to justify a more structured climb, he argued that going alpine style was outright reckless. He raised the issue repeatedly over the course of 2 weeks, and to his surprise, Devi ended up agreeing with him, at least on this point. Seeing the mountain's towering peaks firsthand, she realized it wasn't as straightforward as they had assumed. She brought the concern to her father, convincing him to retrieve the equipment they had left behind. This shift in approach also reshaped the expedition's whole command structure. The team split into two clear factions, Team A and Team B. And despite not being particularly liked by the Unsoelds and their supporters, Roskelly and his Team A were now calling the shots. By the end of July, the expedition had officially set up base camp on a semi-flat section within Nanda Devi's inner sanctuary. The next 1,200 meters up to the advanced base camp proved to be an exhilarating challenge, as the team hauled their supplies up steep, fog-shrouded cliffs. For a brief moment, it seemed like things were finally falling into place. That was, until everything came crashing down. Literally. On August 1st, a massive avalanche from the northwest face came barreling toward their camp. Though it didn't make direct contact, the sheer force of wind and snow was enough to rip away 3 tents and a critical stockpile of supplies. And that was just the beginning. Over the next several days, the mountain unleashed relentless snowfall and back-to-back avalanches triggered by an unstable, overhanging glacier. Hauling supplies up the slopes became a gamble with death. Peter Lev, who actually worked as an avalanche forecaster back home, pointed out that the slopes were unstable during the day and suggested they move loads at night when the snowpack was at its most solid. William, however, dismissed the idea outright. In fact, he laughed at Lev's suggestion and stubbornly continued sending loads up in broad daylight, forcing the teams to maneuver through life-threatening conditions. By then, he had likely grown tired of everyone challenging his decisions. First Roskelly, now Lev. He wanted to reaffirm his authority, but instead, he ended up losing his own support. Out of nowhere, the expedition's co-leader, Ad Carter, announced that he was heading home. Along with him, another team member and Devi's close friend, Elliot Fisher, also walked away from the expedition. Neither of them ever said why they left, but it wasn't hard to figure out. Maybe they thought the route was too dangerous. Perhaps they felt like they weren't needed with so many people already arguing over decisions. Or maybe it was the huge fight they had with Roskelly one night over some management issue. Whatever the reason, their exit left both Devi and William deeply unsettled. From that point on, Roskelly took a step back, While he still led most of the climb, he kept his opinions to himself, wary that if the expedition fell apart, his own summit attempt might be jeopardized. For the next month, everything settled into a routine: setting up ropes, moving gear between camps 1, 2, and 3, dodging avalanches, and dealing with unpredictable weather. Then on September 1st, 1976, Roskeli, along with 2 teammates, became the first climbers from the expedition to reach Nanda Devi's summit. The next day, the trio made it back to Camp 3, clearing the way for Devi and her team to make their own summit push. Devi was accompanied by 27-year-old climbers Andy Harvard and Peter Lev. Over the course of the expedition, she and Harvard had grown close, and their relationship had turned romantic. They had plans to marry after the climb, and William was fully on board with it. But all of that took a backseat to the real problem: the expedition itself. When Roskeli returned to Camp 3, he finally spoke up about Devi's deteriorating condition, now that his own summit attempt was secure. She was supposed to start her ascent immediately after his return, but her condition had worsened to the point that the group remained at Camp 3 instead. She was battling persistent diarrhea and nausea, and no matter how much she tried to hide it, there were days she could barely move. Her hernia had swollen to the size of half an ostrich egg, and she was losing a dangerous amount of blood in her stool. After observing her struggle, Roskeli finally confronted her and Harvard, who had also been feeling unwell, telling them they had no business continuing the climb and needed to descend immediately. His words were met with silence. Then, without breaking eye contact, Devi grabbed a jar of peanut butter, unscrewed the lid, stuck her fingers in, and waved a scoop in the air. "This is the way we do it at Camp 3, she said. The remark wasn't random. It was a direct jab at Roskeli. Back at base camp, Roskeli had been on everyone's case about hygiene. One day, Devi had scooped peanut butter with her fingers, and he called her out. The expedition doctor backed him up, telling everyone to use spoons or crackers instead. Devi had followed the rule ever since, until now. In defiance, she deliberately broke it, mocking Roskeli's authority in the process. Ironically, that same lousy hygiene was probably what got her sick in the first place. The doctor had already warned her that she was practically asking for a stomach bug, maybe even something worse, with the way she neglected cleanliness. And now, with her condition getting worse, he gave her another warning. If she kept pushing, it could be fatal. But Devi had never been more stubborn. After weeks of conflicts and arguments, the whole idea of experience over milestones had pretty much gone out the window. For her, the climb had now turned into a battle to prove everyone wrong. On September 3rd, the team set out for the climb's most technical and demanding section, moving from Camp 3 to Camp 4. William watched from below, and he could tell right away that Devi was moving far too slowly, at nothing like her usual pace. Before sunset, Lev reached Camp 4 and waited. Hours passed, 4, maybe 5, before Harvard finally arrived around 11 p.m. The two of them stayed put, expecting Devi to appear any minute. But when another hour passed without a sign of her, Harvard decided to check. He made his way to the edge of the last ledge and looked down. There she was, stopped just below, completely drained, unable to push forward. Harvard didn't waste a second. He climbed down, helped her up, and finally the three of them made it to Camp 4 at 7,300 meters. For the next 48 hours, Devi and Harvard had no choice but to rest at Camp 4, hoping to regain their strength. Meanwhile, Lev made a solo attempt to reach the summit, but it failed. Finally, on September 6th, Devi and Harvard set out once again, but the brutal conditions overwhelmed them within minutes, forcing a desperate retreat. Despite this, Devi remained adamant that she was fine and just needed some more time to rest, but Lev wasn't having it. He confronted her head-on, laying out the harsh reality of what she was doing to herself. After a long, heated debate, she finally relented, agreeing to descend to Camp 3 to recover before making another attempt. The group planned to move the following day, and just before dawn, William arrived at Camp 4 to escort them. But before they could set foot outside, the weather took a violent turn, trapping them in their tents. It was as if the mountain itself refused to let Devi go. For the next 36 hours, the climbers passed the time, sipping tea, huddling for warmth, swapping stories of past expeditions, anything to distract themselves from the raging storm outside. Then on the night of September 7th, Devi made one last plea before turning in. She didn't want the others to abandon their summit bid because of her. She insisted they should go for it if the weather cleared in the morning. She would wait at camp, and they would all descend together when they returned. It seemed like a reasonable plan, and the men nearly agreed, but in the end, everything depended on what the morning would bring. They had been at a dangerously high altitude for nearly 3.5 days. It wasn't exactly the death zone, but still they'd been stuck above 7,000 meters for over 80 hours. At that point, every second mattered. They needed to make a careful, calculated decision. But in the mountains, you don't always get that luxury. By morning, things took a turn for the worse. A brutal blizzard swallowed Camp 4, leaving them with no choice but to descend as soon as possible. The 4 of them packed up, waiting for even the slightest break in the weather. But as they did, the men noticed something alarming. Devi's face was turning blue, swelling in a way that wasn't normal. By midday, William had stepped outside to check the conditions, while Devi, Harvard, and Lev sat huddled inside the tent, boots on, ready to move the second they got the all clear from William. Devi was sipping hot cocoa when out of nowhere she asked them to check her pulse. Before they could react, she blurted out, almost hysterically, "I'm going to die." Then she pitched forward, vomiting a dark, grainy mess that looked like coffee grounds. Harvard lunged to catch her, shouting for William, who came rushing in a panic. For the next 15 minutes, he did everything he could, CPR, mouth to mouth, fighting to bring her back. But then he felt it. Her lips had turned cold. Still, the frantic, desperate father continued his efforts for another half hour before the truth finally sank in. Devi was gone. The 3 sat behind her body, stiff as statues, their faces empty, like whatever life was in them had left along with hers. No one moved, no one spoke. Then finally, William got to his feet. He had made up his mind. He wouldn't take her body back. He knew Devi was already where she belonged. He and Harvard gently placed her in her sleeping bag, sat beside her and said a prayer. Then without another word, they carried her to the edge of the ledge right next to their tent. With one final push, they let her go. Her body tumbled down the north side of the mountain, swallowed by the very place she had spent her whole life chasing. Since she was a kid, Devi and William would communicate across the mountains by singing a yodel to each other. He'd call out with those deep, high-pitched notes, and no matter how far she was, Devi always answered back. But that day, standing on the ledge where her body had been lost to the mountain, William sang their yodel one last time. For the first time ever, there was no answer, just a cold, creepy silence. The 1976 expedition was the first and last time anyone made it to the top of Nanda Devi from the northwestern side. Devi never reached the summit, but in the end, her death overshadowed everything else. Even John Roskelly, who actually made it to the top, found his achievement buried under the weight of her story, and that obviously didn't sit well with him. Because of her name, many locals still believe she was somehow tied to the goddess Nanda herself, like a reflection of the deity who refused to let her leave the mountain, even when she wanted to. But beyond those legends, her story became a turning point for women in mountaineering. The 1976 expedition threw a spotlight on the deeply ingrained misogyny in the sport. Devi was told, again and again, that she couldn't do it, that she shouldn't even try, not just on that climb, but in her whole life. And she didn't listen. She proved that women had just as much grit, just as much fight as any man on that mountain, or anywhere else for that matter. But in proving that point, she crossed a line no climber should ever take lightly, the one between pushing limits and pushing them too far. Devi indeed pushed herself way too far.